But let's get started. We've got potentially a lot today. So I'm going to let Eric start off. He's got a topic he'd like to introduce. So go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things we wanted to talk about, and this has to do more with the next meeting, I think, or a future meeting, is based on the poll that we had taken from earlier in the year where people expressed their interest in different topics. One of the topics that came up towards the top of the poll was use of open source characterization tools. And so from that perspective, Lee and I wanted to come up with just a small set of questions that we could put out there to see if we can get some of your input on, what is it about some of these questions that's interesting to you? If you know of anybody, or if you are working on a project that has to do with use of open source characterization tools or any kind of characterization tools that might be built into your current repository or software that you're using. We basically wanted to chat about this to see how we could come up with a relevant discussion for the next meeting that would benefit folks. So here are some of the ones that we thought up. And the first one here is just, the basic, how are you using characterization, or if you're using it, meaning, are you exploring something that's out there right now? Are you actively integrating some tooling into your workflows, or are you actually making use of a module that might be in an existing solution that you've made use of for a while? So we're interested in anybody who might be, working within any of these different kind of like areas, basically. And then, the other questions that are here we can go through. But so just off the bat, is there anyone that's kind of making use of or making use of a characterization solution that they found very beneficial right now? Just throw that question out there. Okay, and I know that, let's see, I was just thinking, when Lee and I were talking about this, we were also thinking about different folks that were, that, not yet, Carol says, that did have some tooling in place. I know that there's some tooling in place at that Chronopolis down at UC San Diego is making use of, and I know UCLA is also making use of some characterization in one of their systems. But yeah, Karen just replied, I'm pretty sure we are at WGBH, but I am not the person who knows the specifics. Okay. If you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, and so things like Preservica have it built in, and Bit Curator has various, although they're standalone within Bit Curator, but I'll just throw that out there. That's the level at which I use them, is within sort of already designed systems.
Yeah,
right.
In our system, what we do is we've incorporated Media Info, FFprobe, ExifTool, Tika, SOX, Jove, and all of that is thrown at relevant files, and then it goes through an obsolescence database that we have.
Okay, yeah, and that's one of the things that we've encountered too is, like, when it comes to actually obtaining information about the metadata that flows out of these tools, it can be overwhelming, right? And so where do you store it? What parts of it do you store? How do you effectively get any benefit out of it? Those are all really good questions to talk about. But so that kind of leads into the second question here about what resources are available to make use of the metadata you receive. And then, the other clearly the objectives of having this information around, what does this metadata do in terms of like how does it influence your decisions about what to do in terms of file migrations and when to identify particular like significant part of the corpus that might be affected by some of the metadata that comes out of these. It's like, where do you turn to essentially to make your decisions based on this metadata? So yeah, these, I think we wanted to pretty much get this information out there so folks could reflect on it. If you do have any input in terms of maybe folks we could talk to or might be interested in chatting about what the current solutions that are out there happen to be or what they're making use of, then we'd love to hear about that. So mainly because a lot of folks voted for this when we put that poll out there.
Okay. I see Adrian has said that they use FITS at the University of Georgia before putting files in local storage. And they've gotten as far as analyzing the data, but not actually working with it quite yet.
Right. Okay.
All right, anything else related to characterization?
I'll add real quickly that, and I don't want to involve Adrian in this too much because it was sort of a nascent project that we had to set aside because of the pandemic and everything else. But at the University of Nevada, Reno, we were exploring kind of what we could do to evaluate not only questions of obsolescence, but also how we could leverage some of this information for descriptive purposes. And not just in terms of modification dates and so forth, but we were looking at, broad trends within different portions of a corpus in terms of how, let's say, an office or personnel approach technology and either adopted it early or abandoned it at a certain rate, and how they approached kind of different types of, let's say, productivity software over time. So there were some interesting questions to like engage with on it, but again, without a tool that helps us parse the data, we found ourselves really exploring even just statistical platforms like R or something like that to try and parse this, broad array of data that was sort of thrown at us by the systems. And in that case, it was just basic things like FITS or Droid or, the sort of things that Leo was getting at from BitCarrier.
Right. It's, we at CDL, we ended up a few years ago, and this is before my time there, we ended up using, let's see, it was a combination of Jove, and I think it was a couple other things. Okay, thanks, Nick. And it was just, it was one of those things where, at times the metadata files that were coming out of these tools were larger than the actual files and the objects themselves. So it was a lot of information to parse through. So yeah, I definitely hear it. It sounds like folks have had similar experiences. And then Nick said, might be worth checking out this work from Ross Spencer. Okay. Okay, demystify, interesting. Thanks for the link. All right, so Leah, do you want to go ahead and move on, or?
Sure, yep.
Okay.
Okay, so next we have Linda Tadic, who is the CEO and founder of Digital Bedrock, and she's been involved for over 25 years in leading digital preservation, metadata, and digital production operations. So I will turn, and she's going to talk to us about the environmental impact of digital preservation. So go ahead, Linda.
All righty. Well, thanks for asking me to or inviting me to come and talk about this topic. I know that a couple years ago, this topic was addressed by this group, but you know what? Things change really on a daily basis as far as what digital archives, how all of our archives intersect with the environment. So I'm really always happy to talk about this topic anytime. So again, as I said, rein me in because I can go on at length. So in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm double dipping. Tomorrow night, I'm giving a keynote speech for CIPAVA, which is a conference for Southeast Asian Pacific Audiovisual Archives. And it's supposed to be held in Vietnam, but it's being held virtually. So I'm going to double dip on that presentation a bit, skip all the keynote-y part stuff and just focus more drilling in on the nuts and bolts of how all of our work here intersects with the environment. So a lot of people, and I'm going to share my screen. And again, I'm just going to skip through. So I mentioned the keynote parts and just skip around to specific slides. So a lot of people talk about, energy use that we use with digital archives. And so what I also though want to talk about is not just energy use, but also the hardware that we all have to use to do our work and to preserve digital content, and also how our actions can then also impact it. So it's not just energy use, it's hardware, it's our actions, and also how the pandemic has impacted everything that we can do now, what we learned from the last year and a half living in the pandemic world. So basically, just to give a summary of how our archives intersect with this, so we are actually part of ICT, which stands for Information and Communication Technology, because we use technologies and energy to keep all of our digital content alive. So there are all of these 6 points here of where we create CO2 emissions, because I'm skipping through the whole part I usually give in my talks on like what are the issues with the environment, how we're destroying the planet. I'm going to skip all that and just go and talk about us, what we do. All right, so we are part of ICT because of the power use, obviously. And so what I have there in red is more specifically how we as digital archives intersect with that. So the vast part of CO2 that is put out into the atmosphere is from power use. So how do we generate electricity? Then there's industry, which is basically, we are part of that. We use hardware, your computers, your servers, everything. All of that is manufactured. And so we participate in that as consumers. The surface transport is just basically how you get to work or how these different things are shipped around and how we receive them. We have, your archive, your library, your university, you are in a building. And so that building is then also emitting CO2. Residential, you live somewhere. And so you yourself, especially if you're working from home, that's also emitting CO2. And then we have aviation from travel, from shipping by plane, which decreased a lot. And also the surface transport really decreased a lot during the pandemic period. Now that is starting to trickle back up. So the percent of ICT emissions, so again, the end user devices, that's your computer, the servers that we're using, that is expected to decrease in emissions just because they're getting better in how they're being manufactured. There's less direct and indirect emission rates. There's your telecommunication network. So right now we're streaming this content. So I'm sitting here in LA and it's going around to a data center in downtown LA for Zoom, and wherever you are, it's also going through data centers that are close by you. All of that is going across the network. Now, the data centers where all of these tools are that we use, and if you're using cloud storage, those are all in data centers, even though efficiencies are increasing in how they're being operated and run, it's still going to increase over time just because there's just so much use of the data. We just need to use these data. So I brought up this example. Again, this is double dipping on my conference, which was supposed to have taken place in Vietnam. If I had flown from LAX to Vietnam, my emissions would have been, if I flew economy for that long flight, would be over 1,200 kilograms CO2. Now, it's going to be done on Zoom, just as we're on Zoom right now. Instead, assuming 100 participants for 1 hour using Zoom to attend my keynote will be the equivalent of like driving 3 miles in a gas engine car. So as you can see, just by our changing how we are working now and communicating and not going to conferences so much, we are actually having a direct impact, positive impact on the environment by not traveling, which is something we can think about in our human changes and how we want to limit our CO2. Even though, of course, it's not including any of the CO2 from data centers and everybody has different power suppliers. But let's skip ahead. I'm going to skip this really cool piece from Yoko Ono that started this morning. I got up at 5:30 this morning to see this really cool piece. I'm sorry I don't have time to go on that. It's really neat. Going over, if you want to hop on and go to the Getty's website. So the environment and archives and the environment, because it goes both ways. So the environment is impacting archives through the climate change, but then we are impacting the environment by what we are doing. We are causing the climate change because everything that we do is emitting greenhouse gas emissions. But also what people don't talk about enough is all this hardware, the toxic endangerment to people, and also how we are stripping the planet of its natural resources by all of this technology that we're using. So what can we do to mitigate the environmental impact? It's by preservation actions, by choosing to do things differently. Technology choices, by what kind of hardware you're using. If you're using the cloud, how does that impact the environment? And then of course, there's human choices. Like I just said, do you need to go to conferences, all the time? Can we work from home? Can we do things by Zoom or other means? So again, my talk is on audiovisual preservation because of organization, but it really kind of doesn't matter because it's all going to become digital files. So what we have to deal with is we have legacy media destruction. If you are working with film, video, audio, tape, physical media, you digitize it. Eventually those items, the analog originals, are going to die and you have to dispose of them and destroy them somehow. So that's one way we're contributing to the landfills or to CO2. We have the electricity use, because all of that data is being preserved, made accessible through storage and all of this hardware. We're all using energy resources. And then we have the hardware and media destruction itself, because you have to refresh your digital technology. You have to replace hard drives, servers. If you're on LTO tape, you're going to be migrating generations. What do you do with all of that legacy media? What do you do with it? So, because nothing lasts forever. So I want to focus first on this physical media before we actually get really into the electricity. So every bit of electronic products, they have two service lives. One is the initial, when it's new. That's the original owner, 2 to 8 years, let's just say, like computers, servers. Then the second service life would be after the original owner has used it, you could then sell it, it's being refurbished, and that could go on for 5 to 20 years. But at that end of life, from the end of the second service life, then what happens to it? It becomes e-waste. And that's everything. That's part of it, cables all the way through batteries. And so you have a choice of landfill, incineration, recycling, or exporting. So e-waste itself, all this technology we're using, all the physical technology we're using, you have heavy and rare earth metals and plastic. So that's why you need to consider about the recycling potential of your storage media and devices. Because what we're doing is we're depleting the planet of its natural resources. Because again, these things are requiring heavy and rare earth metals. Everything that you are using right now is using heavy and rare earth metals. But only less than 1% of rare earth elements are being recycled because the technologies don't exist, because they're really difficult to extract out of these devices to then recycle and then repurpose. And they themselves are toxic by their nature. So if you just throw these into a landfill, which does happen, or just throw it in the trash, then all of those toxicities are going into the ground, which can then go into the water. We are also depleting the planet from the silica sand, which is required to make electronics, glass, because that silica sand, that really pure kind of sand, is a finite natural resource. You just can't go down to the beach here in LA and pull up the sand and make, the kinds of silica sand that's required to make the electronics. Helium is then also used in hard drives because the helium is lighter than air. So when these hard drives that have helium instead of just regular air inside them, they use less energy and they can spin 25% faster, use less energy to do that. But there's a shortage of helium on the planet because that is also a finite resource. So we're also depleting the planet of that. Plus in your balloons, I always tell people, don't get helium-filled balloons, do something else. Just don't do that. You're wasting helium. And then the purified water that's required in making microchips and a lot of the technologies. And I don't know if you guys are aware, but there is a shortage of hard drives and solid state drives and just even microchips used in cars. We needed to order ourselves some 14 terabyte hard drives to go into a server for a build that we're doing. There's a 13-week wait for 14 terabyte hard drives for servers. So it's really impacting everybody, all technology around the world. There is a shortage for a couple of reasons, which I'll get into in a second, why that's happened. So plastic, all right, so all of these technologies, all these materials you're sitting in front of right now, they have plastic, and we all know that, yes, plastic or plastic bottles can be recycled, but the kind of plastic that's used in all these computers and these electronics is a different formulation, and every device has a different formulation. So it isn't like you can just recycle it, take something apart and just go ahead and recycle the plastic. It has to be done, appropriately and sent to the correct place. So talking about the different data storage devices that we have, okay, I want to focus on how they're made and then also the recyclability of them. So you have spinning disk, that's those hard drives, you have data tape, LTO, and you have NAND storage or solid state or flash. And if you're using the cloud is using a mix of these three storage media, depending on how you're using it. So even though cloud obviously is not itself a storage medium, they're using these storage media, since so many of you are probably using cloud storage, and we're using the cloud right now by doing Zoom, and it's being recorded, it's being stored. So it's important for all of you to understand about what the impact is of your using the cloud storage, that you are not absolved from your obligations and your responsibilities for how you impact the environment just because you're using cloud storage. Alrighty, spinning disk. Okay, so server, external hard drives, you can put on your desktop, whatever, but it's still a spinning disk, spins around, it's not like solid state. So they are high electricity hogs because they have internal fans, they have to be kept cool to operate. That's why people really like using these helium-filled hard drives, because they reduce energy use. The life expectancy, it depends on how hard they're being run and if they're being run constantly, but basically people tend to replace them every 3 to 5 years, as you probably know, because they can fail and get worn out. And they do have some recyclable parts, but the problem is where for like the server or for the spinning disk is where it's hard to extract out the media or the recyclable materials from it. There are only 3 hard drive manufacturers. Let's skip through that. Now, so for recycling, though, you talk to the I talk to the manufacturers and ask them, so why don't you guys have this figured out? How do you recycle these hard drives? And so this was a couple of years ago, and they said, well, it's difficult because it's death by screws. All of those screws that are used to put in, the magnetic material that's used to store the data, everything that's in it, you have to take it all apart and then take these parts then out to recycle them. Now, and they said it's very difficult to do that, but on the other hand, these manufacturers, they make their living by making these hard drives, that's their company. So it's in their best interest to figure out how to recycle these parts, because they know that they're using finite earth resources. So they want to recycle it. So in the last couple of years, there's more and more out there about how they are actually being able to do this. So like Dell, Seagate, and Teleplan, they developed a way to pull out the magnets, and they're putting them into new laptops. So I think this is really wonderful. Here we have Dell Technologies here, where they also have an international program where you can recycle your computers and servers, and then they help you out. And again, it is international, not just the US. Here's another one, HP has a global program also where you can also then recycle not just your, ink, jet cartridges, but all other kinds of servers and other electronics. Here in the US only is if you're a consumer and you want to recycle Western Digital, they'll actually take any manufacturer's hard drives, but you can recycle like 5 drives at any one time, and then you get a credit back to buy more drives. So they are trying to do something. They understand, that they have to do this because they're not going to be able to keep in business if they run out of materials. There are, this is focusing on Singapore because they have a national e-waste recycling program, which is really cool. Now that's hard drives. Now solid state drives, they're nice because there's no moving parts, so that doesn't take as much electricity. They do have a finite number of writes, but an infinite number of reads. These are not good to use for digital preservation just because they don't last as long and they can fail on you without warning you. They just suddenly are dead. They might slow down for a little bit, but then they're just suddenly gone. Now, our world, what we're doing with all this cryptocurrency going along. So I'm sure that you've all heard about, NFTs, blockchain, cryptocurrency, how it's just using so much energy. And so data centers are being built just to manage cryptocurrency. So Chia is a newer kind of cryptocurrency where they say, well, basically, instead of using all these data centers out there, and they said this was more kind of a green cryptocurrency. But then what they do is that then you basically earn your credits, you earn your Chia coins because of how many hard drives and solid state drives you have. And so this is one of the reasons why there is a shortage of hard drives and solid state drives, because of Chia cryptocurrency. All these people who want to do mining, they're just buying up a lot of hard drives and solid state drives, and they just, because they're running so hard, they're just killing these solid state drives. So this is from a cloud storage provider in France who basically told their clients, hey, if you're doing Chia stuff on our solid state drives in our data center and you are destroying our drives, you pay for them. And I mean, this just came out in May, a month ago. So it's interesting times we're living in. So there is a global storage, media, and computing supply chain shortage, as I mentioned. So there's a microchip and semiconductor shortage right now, partly because of the pandemic, because there was limited need, and then all of a sudden people need it, but also because there's a drought in Taiwan. I think it's like 80% of the microchips, semiconductors are built in Taiwan. And I don't know if you're aware, there's been a drought going on in Taiwan for several months. There's a water shortage there. And because of the water shortage, then they've had to limit and cut back on their microchip and semiconductor production as a result. So that's one of the reasons why there is a slowdown. So again, this is how we are just pulling out of the planet everything we can. We're just killing it. And the planet's telling us, hey, we're not going to give back to you because I don't have water to give you in order to make the stuff that you need. So it's really like this, symbiotic, unfortunately, cycle going on here. And then again, the shortage of hard drives and solid state drives from Chia cryptocurrency use. So those are drives, hard drives, solid state drives. Now we'll go to data tape. Okay, so LTO is the largest market share, so we'll just focus on LTO. LTO can be low to medium electricity use because, hey, you just write it up on a tape, you put it on a shelf, there's no electricity use being used at all except just to store it, sitting there patiently on the shelf. It's only if it's in a robot that you're using up the electronics, that are used. People say that, well, the life expectancy is 30 years, but hey, you're going to replace it anyway every 2 to 3 generations, just as you're going to replace those hard drives or solid state drives that you would have, no matter what. There is no store and ignore digital storage medium. So you just have to deal. You just have to set up the policies and figure it out. So you can recycle LTO, except, there's the plastics, which are recyclable, the screws, but it's on the magnetic material is sitting on mylar, and the mylar itself is recyclable. However, the barium ferrite, the metal particle, other components, you can't really scrape them off the tape. So there really needs to be a lot more research on that, because otherwise then we're just going to, shred up the tape and incinerate it. That's pretty much the way to dispose of those tapes. And again, just as with hard drives, there's also a limited number of LTO tape manufacturers. There's 2 and 1 who makes drives. So it's always, it doesn't matter. We're all kind of beholden to the technology manufacturers as it is. So spinning disk and tape, comparing the cost between them and the energy and whatnot is where the total cost of ownership for disk-based storage, the hard drive solid state, is 26 times that of tape-based, because tape, you don't have to use as much energy for it. It takes up less floor space to store all of that data, which is why when you're thinking about, what you can do with your digital storage, I'll be talking about this more as one of the strategies you can do is more like hierarchical storage management, or HSM, where you have only the files you need immediate access and use for is stored on spinning disk. And then other things you want to keep, you don't need constant access to, your big, huge masters, whatever they are, store those on tape. And it's not like everything has to be stored in one kind of storage medium. You should diversify. So now we're going to jump into the cloud. Okay, basically, as you know, that just means you're storing your files in other people's servers. So the nice thing about it for you as a consumer is that you're just paying for what you use. You don't have to purchase that hardware. You don't have to worry about the energy use. It's somebody else's problem. So it is really helpful because of its economies of scale, because you aren't going out there and buying all the hardware. They're managing it all for you. They're managing the power and air conditioning. Electricity use is optimized, and I say here maybe, because that just means also like what is the power source that a data center is using. And the nice thing about cloud storage, though, obviously, is just because it's so easy to use, you can also then have access to collections from around the world. Here we can talk to each other from around the country. So there is a trend now for universities, archives, libraries, businesses to use the cloud. And it really annoys me when I hear people saying how like now they have a carbon, or organizations say that they are carbon neutral. Basically, they're just using somebody else's carbon. You know, that data center that they're using up in the cloud, they're emitting carbon. They're using carbon fuel for the most part, except for those that are trying to use renewables. But most of them are still carbon. So it's somebody else's carbon, even if you claim that you're carbon neutral. So if you're using the cloud storage, think about your vendor. You know, what power source are they using? Is it dirty power source? So data centers right now use 3% of the world's electricity, and this has grown since 2010, which was 1. And it's estimated now that could even go up to like 7% of the world's electricity within 5 years. So the 6 major cloud service providers, they're moving towards 100% renewable energy. Now, why are they doing this? It's, again, I'm sorry to be cynical, but you know, it's like money is always the bottom line. They're doing it not to save the planet, but because they also know that, hey, it's marketing, it makes them look good. And then, yeah, saving the planet is part of it too, but it's marketing. And it also saves them money from not having to pay electricity to other power providers, energy providers, if they can produce their own through renewable energy. So you'll see that the main ones listed here are going towards renewable energy. They're even building renewable energy sources like wind farms, solar farms. But most of their servers still are in third-party data centers. So for example, the data center where we rent out our space is it's one of the big data centers in Los Angeles. And that's where all of these major providers are. I know full well that this Zoom, you know, signal is going through the data center where we are. You know, Google, Facebook, you know, everybody's there. Everybody's in there. Amazon, Azure, everybody's there. And they don't own that building. You know, they're renting out space like everybody else. And that is using energy not from renewable resources, not yet. Some of it is, but not totally. So there are a lot of data centers around the world, and I'm going to skip through this part because again, this is from a talk I'm giving tomorrow night, but you can just see where they are. And then I focus here on Singapore, since that's the region where I'm going to be talking. Just to give you an idea though about how folks are approaching this is where, so Singapore is like roughly half the square miles of Los Angeles, and they have 60 data centers there within it. We have 73 here. Facebook built a 100% renewable data center in Singapore. They just built up, they have solar panels on the top. Singapore is a very small area, and so they are building these solar panels out here that are floating offshore to produce energy. They also have now built, they have a moratorium now on building data centers because they understand that they need to get their whole energy infrastructure, you know, thought out better. All righty, so that's just a little bit to talk about, to rush through some of the data storage materiality we all have to work with and understand our responsibility to it. Everything that we use, you know, we have to be thoughtful about what kind of media we use, what kind of storage do we use for it. So now what can we do to mitigate our environmental impact? So preservation, technology, human choices. Preservation actions, appraisal policies. Do you need to save everything? Just because it's a digital file, do you need to really save it? Everything that you acquire, everything that you create? Is it for permanent retention? Or is it something where you just need to keep temporarily for a while and then it can be either deleted or moved off to another tier of storage, which I'll get into that whole HSM policies in a second. Appraisal policies also, do you need to save everything at the highest possible resolution? Because the highest resolution obviously is going to be a large file. That means a large amount of storage to manage. So is it possible, if you want to save it, and this isn't saying you shouldn't, but if you do create large files, again, store the large masters offline. You don't need to keep everything in the cloud. You don't need to keep everything online. You know, it just requires some thought. And I brought up this example. I don't know if you're aware of this major fire that happened at Cape Town University in April, which destroyed 3,500 films and books and special collections. And so there was a call that went out to researchers around the world, basically asking, does anybody have low resolution copies? Because they understood that the content is what was important, not whether they had beautiful big files, but they wanted to save the content. And so basically, I always say, like, don't fetishize the file format, you know, when you're thinking about what should you digitize to, as long as it's something that is more sustainable so you can keep it alive going forward. You know, just, you know, you're wasting time and risking losing content that is in analog form just because you're thinking so much about it has to be this big, huge, you know, perfect, wonderful file. A preservation action, then you could do a schedule infrequent fixity checks. When I hear about people who are saying we're doing fixity checks every month, I have to ask why. You know, it also, of course, depends on your storage medium and the system that you're using. Obviously, if files are stored offline, then you don't need to keep checking as long as you know that they were written correctly before they were put off online. If they're stable, you don't need to do it more than even once a year. So this is something I think people should really be thinking about. So using less energy. So I was talking about hierarchical storage management policies, or HSM, if it isn't familiar to you. Basically, there are 3 tiers of storage. First is online. That's your immediate access, your fast access. So that's going to be your spinning disk hard drives or your solid state drives. The second tier would be nearline, which means it could be stored on tape that's in a system so that the files can be retrieved. Or sometimes we'll say, well, their tier 1 files are stored on solid state drives because that's really fast, and tier 2 can be hard drives. Sometimes people just say it's going to be online or offline. Offline is where you're just storing your tape or other media off a network, so it's detached, it's not online. And that means it's a manual process. You have to go and get the media, plug it back in, and then retrieve the file. But basically, if you then apply these tiers and these policies, store the large infrequently accessed files offline, doesn't use electricity, it's cheaper, you know, no energy, and only your frequently accessed files should be online. Because again, spinning disk storage takes 26 times more energy than storing infrequently used files on data tape. So it's mix and match of storage. Using less energy, again, the same concept, store on data tape, LTO, but then that doesn't mean you migrate every time a new generation comes out. You can wait 2 or even 3 generations, you know, take your time. As long as you know the files are written correctly and they're stable, you know, then there's no need to keep migrating them, and that you have the means to be able to play those LTO tapes. Your server rooms do not have to be freezing cold. They can be at 70 to 74 degrees Fahrenheit. Rooms with data tape can be even warmer, just like regular office environment. Turn off any unused servers. I know obviously that if you are all dependent on, you know, your university's IT department, you have no control over this. But basically, if you aren't using servers, turn them off or set them to go into inactive mode if they're not in use. You can use virtualization by putting several applications on one server instead of one box has one application. Use the cloud for some applications. I mean, just be thoughtful if you're using the cloud. Don't just put everything up there and count on the cloud to do everything. Question the data co-location center on its power source, on its green record. You know, really just think it through. Purchase clean energy whenever it's possible, if you can, if you have that choice to do it, not coal-generated energy. Purchase hardware that's energy efficient. You do that at home. Why not do it also at work or in your archive? Purchase recycled or refurbished devices as much as possible. We do that. You know, I mean, all you have to do is really, the only thing that really have to keep updating all the time are the hard drives, you know, as they wear out. But a lot of these materials can last a good long time if you keep them up in good maintenance. Which is kind of like number 4, upgrade your servers by upgrading the drives, not the entire box. Recycle by reuse whenever possible. Recycle data tape and hard drives with vendors who will actually strip out the parts, or use some of those, like as mentioned before, like Dell, HP, you know, they have programs where you can actually, then they will take your old media and take care of the recycling themselves. It's in their own best interest to do that. So what did we learn then? The human extra archival actions, again, working from home as much as you can, which I think is just going to be the state of things now. Everybody learned a lot from this whole pandemic period. Less, because then we have less automobile emissions, less oil and gas use, which also means less demand, which also then feeds into investors saying, we're not going to invest in oil and coal anymore, which already is the trend. They're already going towards renewables. So we just need to encourage them by consumer actions, by going towards renewables. Hold remote conferences or hybrid events. I think that's just going to be the state of things, going forward. We've all learned a lot. These remote events really help people then, you can participate more. I'm sure we all have done that, participate in conferences, which we never would have been able to go travel to. So I think our lives have just changed as a result for the better, even though we still miss people, we want to see people, but I think we'll find a good middle ground. All right. Thank you, guys. That's
Thank you, Linda. That was really fascinating. I know you did a quick zoom through what you're going to do tomorrow, but that was a lot of information, and I'm fascinated by it. I have a couple of questions, and hopefully others do as well. I was surprised that you didn't have Amazon down as one of the service providers. I would have thought Amazon would be huge. What would explain that?
You mean a service provider as far as going towards renewables? Amazon is not building renewable data centers. No,
as one of the cloud service providers.
Well, the only names that I named were in the context of which ones are going towards or building renewable.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I misunderstood that. Yeah.
Yeah, those were the only ones who are named. Amazon is actually, I'm trying to be really careful with this presentation because it is going, well, this one was recorded, but the one I'm giving tomorrow night is going to be on, Facebook.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to say anything bad about any, because normally when I give these talks, I do say, hey, here's a grading sheet from Greenpeace. Because Greenpeace has, unfortunately, it's not even a couple of years, it's been like 3-4 years since they've released this, it's called Clicking Clean. And they have a scorecard for all the cloud providers or streaming services. And Amazon is not high up there. And largely that's because, especially in the government cloud area, that whole area of Northern Virginia, most of that, if not, virtually all of it is all coal generated for the most part, except for a bit of wind. So if we go to
Greenpeace and just sort of Google Greenpeace and cloud provider environmental concerns, we should be able to find that. That would be interesting to see.
Yeah, type in Clicking Clean.
Clicking Clean. Got it.
Yep,
okay.
And Greenpeace, and you should find. Oh, look, Sarah just put it up there.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
The other question I was curious about is whether or not, if for the major cloud service providers, if when you get to nearline and particularly cold line storage, if they actually are using tape, do we know that?
They are using tape, yes.
Okay,
they won't tell you that, but they are, yes.
So any cold line storage with Amazon or Google or whomever, we can know that that's tape storage.
Yes, in fact, so when Fuji and Sony a couple of years ago, they had a big patent lawsuit around LTO8 technologies. And so there was a shortage of LTO8 came out, and then all of a sudden you couldn't buy any tape because this patent lawsuit, and that's because all of the cloud providers just bought it all up. They bought all the stock.
Wow.
Because they use it.
Yeah. Fascinating. Okay. Other people, do you have questions for Linda?
Hi, Linda. Really, really interesting presentation. I wanted to ask about your recommendation on fixity, once a year. And I'm not disputing that, but I'm wondering where that number came from. Is that based on any empirical study, or is that more just your intuition and your experience is telling you that?
Yeah, that totally depends on how the files are being stored, which is why when I read fixity and how often people are doing it, what I want to know is, well, how are those files being stored? So for example, so we write files off to LTO because we're a dark archive as a service, And we are so careful in how those files are written that we know that they were all written correctly, and we check them once a year, and every single file has been fine. So I think if it's in pretty stable storage and you know it was written right, why check it more than once a year, even twice a year? If it's stored online, and if there's, and those disks are constantly spinning, and there's a risk for the files to be, potentially damaged, because then you might want to do it more than that. It's just when I hear about people saying they're doing it daily or they're doing it monthly or something like that, that's where I start getting, really? Plus, you should not have all of your files just stored in one location anyway, all on spinning disk. You should really diversify that storage.
Right. Great. Okay. Thank you.
And we have
there's
a question, on chat. How do we compare the ability of cloud storage providers versus our local IT departments to implement strategies like spinning down drives or not overbuying capacity?
The cloud providers will not tell you what they do, so don't even bother asking. They won't do it. So it's more a matter. They're constantly running. They're constantly spinning. So it's more a matter of asking them with your IT people, are they doing it? So that's how you're going to compare.
Okay, other questions?
I will echo Stephen's comments. It was very interesting to hear this sort of synthesized in a presentation. I've read some of the similar work that's been published that you cited on this. And I'm just curious, Linda, if you could talk for a second about the issue that you just raised, which is the lack of transparency from cloud providers. Obviously, there are resources like ClickClean and others that are great. And I don't want to minimize the degree to which that's useful information, but I'm wondering if you could talk about other types of questions or strategies that you have found to be effective when trying to parse or understand the impact of different behaviors on behalf of cloud providers when you're interacting with them, on a vendor basis, as opposed to trying to do broader research using a resource like Greenpeace.
Right. So the main ones, we're talking about Amazon. Amazon is the least transparent of all of them I've ever spoken to. And Google, I've only gotten answers out of them because I know pretty well this one guy who's in charge of some of the operations here in LA, but there's nothing official. Azure is kind of like halfway. It depends who you talk to. The most transparent cloud provider I've ever dealt with is Wasabi, which is why actually we have a partnership with Wasabi. Whereas like people want to have their files in the cloud as well as like we do preservation work or whatever. We use them because not only are they transparent, but also I know where the data is. And so I know that the data that we use, we're storing it in the Wasabi data center that they use in close by Portland, Oregon, which is all running on hydroelectricity. So it's renewable energy sources, which is one of the reasons why I went with Wasabi, besides they're good people. And I think that they're ethical.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Other questions? Go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry, I have a monthly meeting that always conflicts with this. So my late join is not based on not wanting to hear this wonderful discussion, but knowing it's recorded always makes me a little more relaxed. So thank you. I don't know if this is more of a general question because I have heard I was trying to type it out furiously, but worried that we would end before I would get it done. So I've heard such great things about Wasabi, and I know Stanford has been using them, and they seem like the scrappy fourth coming up into cloud computing. And I wonder how wide the market is, because I haven't heard not really a mention of anyone else that I've heard people have the faith that they have in Wasabi. And so it's interesting to me. And I see that their practices seem like something, as much as I'm going to trust one of these huge companies, and they're much smaller comparatively, of course. But is there a fifth and a sixth out there? Is there anyone out there that you also see as one to watch? Because you want to have lots of different locations, you're going to have to work with multiple vendors. But for players out there, is doesn't give me the peace of mind that 10 would or 7 would. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah. Well, there are other providers, definitely. It just depends on if, when I'm looking at them, I'm thinking about, well, are they going to be around for a while? Where are the data centers? Do they really have a lot of, are they careful in how they do it, or are they sloppy? And so there is one, and I know this is being recorded, so I have to be really careful in what I say, but there is, so I'm not going to name names in this case, but there is another cloud provider. I find that they're a little bit sloppy in what they do, in how they, anyway, but they are a big name that's out there. And so I don't go with them. There are a lot of cloud providers. I mean, there are those in the world. I mean, look at what I just posted up. There's one in France, it's not just, we're so US focused, US centric. We're just thinking about the big boys, that we know of here, but there are others. Yes, there are others. But if you want to stay in the US and North America, then pretty much the ones that you're familiar with, those are the ones, other than the one that I don't want to name by name.
So I will add one quick note there. When we were considering Wasabi at UC, which we ended up, we did make a created contract with them. We also considered Backblaze. And I think, the main difference there for us really was the API layer, because Wasabi has an S3 compatible API layer, and that's what all of our services use. And without that, we would have to, Backblaze does not have that. And so that was pretty much one of the decision points that was very important.
Okay, other questions? Okay, going once, going twice, going 3 times. All right, so thank you very much, Linda. That again was fascinating. I'm happy to have all this data to help have this discussion where we are. So appreciate that.
Thanks for giving me a little bit of a test dry run for tomorrow night. I'll go slower tomorrow, though. I'll have more time.
Yes, good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck tomorrow night.
Yeah, good luck.
Thank you.
Okay, so our third agenda point was to talk about upcoming meetings. And for those of you who were at our last month's meeting, we did a sort of question answer, gave people the opportunity to come and bring problems that they had that other people might help them to find solutions for. And one of the things that Eric and I talked about was maybe combining sort of a formal presentation meeting with the kind of meeting that we had last week, and maybe seeing if there were people out there who would like to volunteer to bring something forward to the group, not necessarily as in a finished presentation, ta-da, look what we did kind of thing, but this is something that we're doing or we're thinking of doing, and these are some of the challenges that we have. So it's sort of planning to have people, specific people, talk about projects that they're working on where they maybe would like some feedback on. Eric, does that represent what you had in mind as well? Did I describe that right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we had, I think we all had a really good conversation in the last meeting, and it was that sort of solution room type, model that also they're going to have present at the NDSA DigiPres conference. So yeah, just providing a little bit more structure and having an idea of, 1 or 2 folks who want to come to each meeting and talk about something. And like you said, it definitely doesn't have to be anything polished, but it would just provide us with some structure that might be beneficial. Yeah.
Because we are coming to the end of the list of things that we had at the beginning of the year in terms of topics. So in addition to, if anybody has one of these use cases that they'd like to bring forward, that's great. If anybody has topic suggestions for the kind of presentation that Linda just did, we can see if we can find somebody who might be willing to talk about that. So we're looking for all kinds of different suggestions at this point.
And we can also send out an email, between this meeting and next meeting, and give folks a chance to think about it, and if they have any ideas. So, how about we plan to do that?
Yeah.
All right, sounds good. Okay, well we've got just a couple minutes left. Anything else you wanted to mention, or?
Anything that anybody else would like to, any questions, comments of any kind before we sign off? Okay.
All righty.
Thanks very much for everybody showing up. And again, thanks very much to Linda for a fascinating topic.
Yeah, much appreciated. All right, well, hope to see you next month.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.